Hello, I'm Annette Kane. Firstly, we're going to be working in a way that's detailed and careful, which I always feel is safer and more predictable. But I'd also like to share with you ways of working that are looser and more experimental. To paint well in watercolour has a lot to do with confidence and feeling able to take a risk or two without being too concerned about the results. Mistakes are, after all part of the learning process. Let's begin by looking at ways of working in detail. So I've chosen this photograph here to work from. I have added to it as well because these pots are empty, which look a bit strange. So I've chosen this plant from this pot here. Plus I'd like to add some tall flowers in the foreground to add a bit of depth to the painting, and these flowers for the bottom right hand corner. So it's a mix of 4 photographs. I rarely use just one straight photograph. It's never exactly how I want. Now I'm going to start with some masking out. I don't like to mask out too much because I think it does look too obvious, but there's some places where it really is quite useful to be able to do it. For example, we've just got a bit of wire netting here. I'm using the drawing pen here. If you haven't got one of these, an ordinary pen and ink pen will do. And finally, using a brush which is actually a masking fluid brush, I'm going to put these leaves in here. You'll see from the photograph that the light's falling on these leaves and they actually don't have any colour on them at all because of the way the light's catching them. I think I'll call it a day at that. As I say, I don't want to use it too much because it does look very obvious if it's all been masked out. We'll just leave that to dry for a moment. I think first of all I'll put some fairly thin colour on just as a sort of undercoat, just to get me started. I'm mixing some yellow and manganese blue, and I'm just going to dot it around a bit. Yeah, I'm just going to spray that as well, just to wet the paper, and a lot of this will be covered up at the end. I'm just putting a bit of green gold in there as well. In a way, it is a little bit like, it isn't like painted by numbers, that's not strictly true, but you are working in very distinct areas, bit at a time, to build up the painting in that way, rather than working the whole thing all at once. I'm just going to pick out bits of the painting to concentrate on. So if we look at this plant from this pot here, part of the key to painting something like that is to use the right sort of brush. So for this I shall use this short sword liner. It's a lovely orangey colour, so I'm going to mix some lemon yellow and some brown madder. You know, it won't be a bright orange, it's a bit more subtle. So you can see that the brush is the right shape for the leaves. So you press down to begin with and pull the brush off the paper. They're not all the same colour, of course, so now I'll darken them with a bit of burnt sienna and green gold. I'll either put new ones in or go over the ones that are already there. So I'm not following the pencil lines exactly. I'm going to do this plant here next, partly because I'd like to get the top half of the painting done before the bottom half, really. Logistically, it means that you're not leaning on work that might be wet. I'm using a tissue because I don't want the brush to be too full of paint. The stem is quite dark. So I'll do the pale leaves first before I do the stems. I don't want the first one to dry too much. I would like the stem and the leaves to run into each other a bit. Now if you feel it is a little bit too dark, which perhaps it is at the top, you just blot it off a bit with some tissue. It's easier to paint the leaves before the background because, unlike acrylics and oils, you can't paint over areas with watercolour. So it's much easier to, in this instance, to paint the leaves first. Now I'm going to do the table and chairs. I'm going to use a flat brush that's about the right width. So about the right width of the table legs. The brushes I use are, virtually all of them are synthetic brushes. So I find that they're very consistent in quality. And of course they're much cheaper than sable. I'm using a mix of burnt sienna and French ultramarine, which I think gives a nice warm brown. And as you mix it on the palette, you pick up more brown one time and more blue the next, so you get some variation. I'm working quite closely, but I'm not, the work isn't terribly detailed, it's just quite carefully done. I'll leave that for the moment and come back over here to do this. I'm not very good on flowers, so I can't tell you what it is, but it's some sort of foxglove, I think. I'm using an ultramarine violet, which is quite a thin purple. And I'm going to work down the flower with a purple and a yellowy green simultaneously so that they bleed into each other. So we'll go back to the green now and work my way down the flower. Towards the bottom of the flower there are fewer petals and more leaves, so I've just introduced some lemon yellow and manganese blue just to make it more of a green. And down at the bottom here, some of the leaves have got the light shining on them, so they'll either need to be left white or painted quite thinly and blotted. I will need to come back again to this plant at some stage because it's not really finished until you've put something next to it. I'm going to show you a way of painting plants using a spray bottle. Basically all you have to do is put on a few random dots of green and give it a quick spray. This is particularly useful when you're painting plants that are in the distance, where you're not going to paint every petal. I'm just going to add some lemon yellow at the top of the plant where it's going to be lighter, and some darker colour underneath the plant where the light isn't shining. You see, that's quite a quick and effective way of doing a little plant. I'm going to do the same to this plant as well. I quite like the way that this plant in this pot looks a bit half dead and not too attractive, because if everything's too perfect it looks a little less interesting and a bit too chocolate boxy. Just a little bit on this. Next I'm going to paint the pots. Part of their charm is that they're all very different and they're all slightly different types of terracotta, and there's a couple there that are glazed. But one thing I am going to alter is the fact that in the photograph they're not in sunlight, and I'm going to paint them as if they are. First of all, I've put out some flesh ochre. This was my brown madder and that's my burnt sienna. And I'm going to start with this dark side of the pot. I've just put a bit of French ultramarine in there. I'm going to start with the dark side of the pot with watercolour that's fairly thick. And then I'm going to wash the brush, take out the excess moisture on a tissue, and then let the colour bleed across. Again, the same thing. So that's a very basic blending technique. If you want to add more texture to the pot, because some of them are quite crumbly and old, you drop some water on. Or if you want it to make it a little bit paler, just blot a bit of the colour off. I'm just going to work my way across the pots, but I'm going to make each one of them slightly different in colour. Obviously you make them more interesting, more realistic really. I'm going to do this big one next because I'm on my terracotta at the moment, so